My husband abandoned and cheated on me for my best friend. Silent revenge and $450,000 income exposed. My husband demanded a divorce, clueless that I earned $450,000. He sneered. I refused to be tied to a lazy, worthless woman. Later, he married my best friend, only to choke on his own arrogance when he discovered my success. The look on his face? Priceless. Thomas handed me the divorce papers with the smug expression of someone who thought he was about to leave a penniless woman with nothing. He'd calculated everything based on what he believed about my income, my worth, my ability to survive without him. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with another email from my literary agent about international publishing rights. The irony was delicious. While he'd been planning his exit strategy, I'd been building an empire he didn't even know existed. Danielle watched from the doorway, probably already planning how to spend what she thought would be his newfound freedom from financial responsibility. $1,000 a month in alimony seems fair, Thomas declared, setting his briefcase on my hospital bed like this was just another business transaction. Since you don't actually work. I glanced at my phone screen where the email notification showed a 7-figure offer for film rights to my children's book series. Don't actually work, if he only knew. But let me take you back to how we got here. Because this moment of pure arrogance was built on 15 years of careful deception, not mine, but his. Before we dive deeper into Rachel's journey, if you believe in the power of quiet strength and turning betrayal into triumph, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share these empowering stories with more women who need them. I was 22 and desperately broke when Thomas first noticed me in that cramped coffee shop near Northwestern University. My art supplies were spread across a tiny corner table, and I was nursing a single latte that had to last me the entire afternoon while I worked on portfolio pieces. Student loans were crushing me, and my parents kept suggesting I switch to something more practical, like business or teaching. Thomas appeared beside my table without warning, his shadow falling across my sketchbook. "That's remarkable," he said, pointing to my drawing of an elderly man reading by the window. "You've captured something. Most people would never even notice." He was handsome in that clean-cut, confident way that usually intimidated me, pressed khakis, button-down shirt, hair perfectly styled despite the Chicago wind. The kind of man who looked like he had his entire future mapped out in 5-year plans. "I'm Thomas," he said, sliding into the opposite chair without invitation. "And you're incredibly talented." That was Thomas. Bold, decisive, unafraid to insert himself into any situation. Within minutes, he'd convinced me to show him my entire portfolio, studying each piece with genuine fascination. He asked questions about technique and inspiration that no one had ever bothered to ask before. "This Fox character," he said, lingering over my sketches of what would eventually become Brave Little Fox. "There's something special about him. He's got personality, real depth for a children's illustration. His enthusiasm was intoxicating. Here was someone who not only understood my art, but could envision its potential in ways I'd never considered." Thomas worked in marketing for a downtown firm and had big plans, starting his own agency, traveling the world, building something meaningful. "I can see you illustrating for major publishers," he continued, carefully turning pages in my sketchbook. "Your style would translate beautifully to children's books. Have you thought about developing this fox into a series?" I hadn't, but suddenly I could see it. Thomas had a gift for making dreams seem achievable, for taking my quiet artistic aspirations and painting them in bold, confident strokes. Our courtship unfolded like something from a romantic movie. Thomas would pick me up in his Honda Civic and drive us to hidden hiking trails or small galleries he discovered online. He genuinely seemed fascinated by my creative process, often sitting quietly while I sketched landscapes or painted watercolors of our adventures. "You see the world differently," he told me one evening as we sat on the shores of Lake Michigan, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades I was already planning to recreate on canvas. "You notice beauty in places where other people just see ordinary life." Those words meant everything to someone who'd spent her childhood being called impractical by well-meaning relatives. Thomas made me feel like my artistic vision had value, like my perspective mattered in ways I'd never imagined. He proposed 6 months later with a simple silver band he'd bought with his tax refund. The proposal happened in that same coffee shop where we'd met, at the exact table where he'd first seen my work. "I know I can't afford the ring you deserve right now," he said, dropping to one knee while other customers pretended not to stare. "But I promise you, Rachel, I'm going to build a life where you never have to worry about money again, where you can focus entirely on your art without stress about bills or rent or any of that practical stuff that kills creativity." I said yes before he finished speaking. Our wedding was small but perfect, just immediate family and close friends in his parents' backyard. His mother, Margaret, had transformed the space with string lights and mason jars filled with wildflowers from her garden. My parents, practical people who'd never understood my artistic pursuits, seemed charmed by Thomas's obvious devotion and clear plans for our future. "He really loves you," my mother whispered during our first dance to music playing from Thomas's ancient boombox. "I can see it in how he talks about your dreams like they're his own." He was right. In those early years, Thomas looked at me like I was something precious and rare. He'd surprise me with art supplies he couldn't really afford, or take me to gallery openings where he'd introduce me to strangers as my wife, the artist, with unmistakable pride in his voice. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery downtown, and Thomas immediately converted the second bedroom into a studio for me. He painted the walls bright white, installed extra lighting fixtures, and even built custom shelves for my supplies using YouTube tutorials and borrowed tools. "Every artist needs proper workspace," he declared, standing back to admire his handiwork. "This is where you're going to create masterpieces." Every morning, I'd wake to the smell of fresh bread from below and find Thomas making coffee in our miniature kitchen, already dressed for work but never too rushed to ask about my plans for the day. "What's brave little fox up to today?" he'd ask, referring to the character I'd been developing based on his early encouragement. "He's learning to be brave enough to cross the big river," I might answer, or "He's helping a lost bunny find her way home through the dark forest." Thomas would listen intently, offering suggestions or asking questions that helped me work through plot problems. He became my first audience, my sounding board, my most enthusiastic supporter. Those early years felt magical in their simplicity. Saturday mornings meant farmers' markets where I'd sketch vendors while Thomas charmed everyone from the honey seller to the elderly woman who made soap from goat milk. Evenings were for cooking together in our cramped kitchen, sharing cheap wine and planning imaginary vacations to places we couldn't yet afford. "Someday we'll go to Tuscany," Thomas would say, studying travel brochures spread across our kitchen table. "You can paint those rolling hills and cypress trees in person." "Someday," I'd agree, adding details to my sketch of him reading those same brochures by candlelight. What I didn't tell him was that someday was arriving faster than either of us expected. 3 months after our wedding, I sold my first professional illustration to a parenting magazine for $75. 6 months later, a small publisher expressed serious interest in developing Brave Little Fox into a picture book series. The money started modestly, $50 here, $100 there, but it was steady and growing. More importantly, it was mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't completely dependent on someone else's income. The feeling was both thrilling and somehow dangerous. I opened a separate business account, telling Thomas it was for tax purposes and to keep my freelance earnings organized. Really, I wasn't entirely sure why I felt compelled to keep my growing success quiet. Maybe it was because Thomas took such visible pride in being our provider, in fulfilling the promise he'd made during his proposal. Or maybe some instinct was already warning me that financial independence was something worth protecting. Whatever the reason, I downplayed my earnings and let Thomas believe his marketing salary was our primary source of security. When royalty checks arrived, I'd deposit them quietly and continue living as if we were still the struggling newlyweds sharing ramen dinners and dreaming of better days. "You don't need to stress about money anymore," Thomas would tell me whenever I expressed concern about a large purchase or unexpected expense. "That's my responsibility now. Your job is to create beautiful things and let me handle the practical stuff." And I did create beautiful things. My Brave Little Fox series found its publisher, then its audience, then its merchandising deals. Corporate clients started requesting my illustrations for advertising campaigns. International publishers began expressing interest in foreign language rights. But I also created something else during those early years, something I didn't fully understand at the time, a foundation of secret financial strength that would prove invaluable when everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and marriage came crashing down around me. The woman Thomas was now trying to destroy financially had actually been supporting both of our lifestyles for years, building an empire while he took credit for our comfortable life. The irony would have been funny if it weren't about to become the perfect weapon in my own hands. The shift happened on a Thursday night in October, during one of our usual dinner parties at Anthony and Danielle's house. We'd been doing these monthly gatherings for 3 years, taking turns hosting, trying new recipes, playing board games until midnight. It was our tradition, our way of staying connected as couples, navigating our late 20s. Danielle had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her salmon and declining the wine she normally loved. Anthony kept shooting her encouraging glances across the table, and I noticed his hand resting protectively on her shoulder whenever he passed behind her chair. "We have something to share," Danielle announced as Anthony began clearing the dinner plates. She stood slowly, placing both hands on her still flat stomach with a gesture so deliberate it could only mean one thing. The smile that spread across her face was radiant, transforming her entire appearance. "We're having a baby." The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Thomas exploded from his chair. Not Anthony, Thomas. My husband reached Danielle first, wrapping her in an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground and lasted far longer than any congratulatory hug should. "This is incredible," Thomas exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion I'd never heard before. "When? How far along? Have you seen a doctor yet?" Anthony stood frozen beside the kitchen counter, dinner plates still in his hands, watching his wife being celebrated by another man. His smile looked forced, almost painful, and he kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. The rest of the evening became the Thomas and Danielle show. He peppered them with questions about due dates, nursery themes, and potential baby names. He knew more about pregnancy symptoms than I did, rattling off information about morning sickness remedies and prenatal vitamin recommendations like he'd been studying for months. "Have you thought about a birthing plan?" Thomas asked, leaning forward with intense focus. "Natural birth versus epidural? Hospital versus birthing center?" "Thomas," I interrupted gently, "maybe let them process this themselves first." He shot me a look of pure irritation. "This is important, Rachel. These decisions matter." Danielle basked in his attention, her hand never leaving her stomach as she answered his endless questions. Anthony grew quieter with each passing hour, eventually retreating to the kitchen to do dishes while Thomas discussed baby-proofing strategies and college savings plans. When we finally left that night, Thomas couldn't stop talking. The 15-minute drive home became a monologue about how wonderful it was that our group was expanding, how exciting it would be to have a little one around, how much fun family vacations would become. "Isn't this amazing, Rachel?" he said, pulling into our driveway with unusual speed. "A baby. Our first baby in the group." The possessive way he said "our" made my stomach clench. "It's their baby, Thomas, Anthony and Danielle's." "Of course," he said quickly, but something in his eyes suggested otherwise. "I just meant we'll all be part of this child's life, like aunts and uncles." I went to bed that night with an uneasiness I couldn't name, watching Thomas research baby gear on his laptop until nearly 2 a.m. Within weeks, Thomas had transformed into Danielle's personal pregnancy consultant. He called her daily to check on morning sickness symptoms, researched the best obstetricians in our area, and somehow knew more about her appointment schedule than Anthony did. "Dr. Martinez is supposed to be excellent," Thomas announced over breakfast one Tuesday, reading from his phone. I found 3 reviews that specifically mentioned his bedside manner with first-time mothers. "How do you know Danielle's looking for a new doctor?" I asked. "She mentioned it yesterday when I called to check on her nausea levels." The casualness with which he discussed my best friend's bodily functions was disturbing. When had they become so intimate that morning sickness was acceptable phone conversation? Thomas started carrying crackers in his car, just in case Danielle needed them during their increasingly frequent outings. He downloaded 3 different pregnancy tracking apps, setting notifications for weekly development milestones that he'd share with me over dinner like breaking news. "The baby is the size of a blueberry this week," he'd announce. "Can you imagine? Something that tiny already has a heartbeat." The final straw came when Thomas quit smoking overnight, something I'd been asking him to do for our entire relationship. "It's not healthy to be around pregnant women," he explained, tossing his half-full pack into the trash with theatrical determination. "Secondhand smoke can cause birth defects." "I've been asking you to quit for 3 years," I said quietly. "This is different, Rachel. This is about protecting an innocent child. What about protecting your wife? His jaw tightened. This isn't about you right now. Some things are bigger than our personal preferences. That night, I heard him on the phone with Danielle discussing prenatal yoga classes and organic grocery stores that carried pregnancy-safe cleaning products. His voice carried a tenderness I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. 6 months into Danielle's pregnancy, I reached my breaking point. We were having dinner at our kitchen table when Thomas casually mentioned signing up to volunteer coach for a youth soccer league. I figured I should get some practice, he said, cutting his steak with unusual precision. You know, for when the baby gets older. I set down my fork with deliberate control. Thomas, are you planning to be this child's father? His face flushed deep red, his hand still on his knife. What kind of question is that? A legitimate one. You know more about Danielle's pregnancy than her own husband does. You've changed your entire lifestyle around her needs. You're making long-term plans that involve raising someone else's child. How can you be so heartless? He exploded, standing abruptly from the table. Danielle needs support right now. Anthony works 60-hour weeks and barely has time to take her to appointments. You've never wanted children. You couldn't possibly understand what she's going through. And you do understand. Since when did you become an expert on maternal needs? The argument escalated quickly from there. Thomas accused me of jealousy, selfishness, and failing to support our friends during an important time. I accused him of emotional infidelity and abandoning his marriage for the fantasy of someone else's family. Maybe if you showed half the interest in other people's lives that you show in your art career, he snapped, you'd understand what real friendship looks like. We slept in separate bedrooms that night, the first time in our marriage. Thomas apologized the next morning, bringing me coffee in bed and promising to be more mindful of boundaries. But his behavior didn't change. If anything, he became more secretive about his time with Danielle, claiming he was protecting her from unnecessary stress by not mentioning their conversations to me. When Harper was born on a rainy Tuesday in May, Thomas was the second person to hold her. Not me, not Danielle's mother, not any of her other friends, Thomas. I stood in the hospital doorway watching my husband cradle my best friend's newborn daughter with tears streaming down his face. She's absolutely perfect, he whispered, and Danielle beamed at him with an intimacy that made my chest ache. Anthony sat in the corner chair looking exhausted and overwhelmed, like a man who'd just witnessed a miracle but couldn't quite process the implications. Thomas, meanwhile, looked complete, like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment, this child, this purpose. The weeks following Harper's birth became a blur of Thomas's daily hospital visits, arriving with flowers, baby clothes, and an enthusiasm that bordered on manic. He knew Harper's feeding schedule, her sleep patterns, her preferred burping techniques. I realized with growing horror that my husband was more invested in this child's well-being than I was in my own career milestones. She smiled at me today, Thomas would report over dinner. Real smiles, not just gas. The nurses said it's early for social smiling, but Harper's clearly advanced. As Thomas became more entrenched in his role as Harper's surrogate father, Anthony began disappearing from our friend group entirely. He'd make excuses to skip dinners, arrive late to gatherings, and leave early with vague mentions of work deadlines. When I tried to connect with him, he'd change the subject or claim overwhelming stress was making him poor company. I found myself increasingly isolated, watching my marriage dissolve while my career ironically flourished. Publishers were calling with new opportunities, international rights deals were materializing, and my bank account grew steadily. But professional success felt meaningless when my personal life was crumbling around me. Late at night, while Thomas was at Danielle's house helping with bedtime routines and night feedings, I'd work on illustrations with a desperate intensity, pouring my loneliness and confusion into children's stories about brave little animals finding their way home through dark forests. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my marriage fell apart, I was creating my most successful work about courage, friendship, and finding strength in solitude. What I didn't anticipate was how completely Thomas would embrace his unofficial role as Harper's father as she grew older. By her second birthday, he was the one researching preschools and debating the merits of Montessori versus traditional education with Danielle over long phone calls that stretched well past dinner time. Harper needs structure, but also creative freedom, Thomas would explain to me afterward as if I'd asked for his educational philosophy. Danielle agrees that academic pressure this early could stunt her natural curiosity. When Harper turned 3, Thomas insisted on throwing her birthday party at our house because we had the bigger backyard. I watched from the kitchen window as he pushed her on the swing set he de-installed the weekend before, a swing set we'd never discussed, never budgeted for, that simply appeared one Saturday morning along with Thomas's announcement that Harper needs outdoor play equipment. The other parents at that party naturally assumed Thomas was Harper's father. He wore that assumption like a comfortable jacket, introducing himself as Harper's Thomas and discussing her developmental milestones with the casual authority of someone who'd been present for every first word, first step, first scraped knee. Anthony sat alone on our back porch during that party, nursing a beer and watching his daughter call another man Daddy Thomas while her actual father became increasingly invisible in her life. By kindergarten, Thomas attended every parent-teacher conference, knew Harper's teacher Mrs. Rodriguez's coffee preferences, and had strong opinions about her reading level and social development. He'd bring home detailed reports of these school meetings, sharing Harper's progress with me as if I were an interested family friend rather than his wife. "She's testing above grade level in reading comprehension," he announced one evening, waving Harper's report card with paternal pride. "Mrs. Rodriguez thinks she might be ready for advanced placement next year." I studied Thomas's face as he spoke, noting the way his entire expression transformed when discussing Harper. This was the look I'd hoped to see someday if we'd had children together. Pure, uncomplicated love, mixed with fierce protectiveness and genuine pride. Instead, I was witnessing it directed toward another woman's child, while our own marriage withered from neglect. The photos started appearing everywhere around our house. Harper's school pictures joined our wedding photos on the mantelpiece. Harper's artwork covered our refrigerator. Thomas's wallet bulged with snapshots of Harper at various ages, and his phone background cycled through her latest pictures like a devoted parent's digital shrine. Meanwhile, our conversations became perfunctory exchanges about household logistics and social obligations. Thomas would update me on Harper's activities with enthusiasm, then ask about my work with polite disinterest before returning to his phone to text Danielle about Harper's bedtime routine or weekend plans. 3 years passed this way, with Thomas becoming more embedded in Harper's daily life while I became increasingly peripheral in my own marriage. We were polite roommates sharing expenses and occasionally appearing together at social functions where Thomas would spend most of the evening discussing Harper's latest achievements with other parents. The night everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was working late in my studio, putting finishing touches on illustrations for a new publisher, when I heard the doorbell ring at nearly 11 o'clock. Thomas was at one of his client meetings, the frequency of which had increased dramatically since Harper started school. I opened the door to find Anthony standing on my porch looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and he carried a tablet clutched against his chest like evidence in a murder trial. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I stepped aside to let him in, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he set the tablet on my kitchen table. Anthony was always precise, methodical, the kind of person who debugged software problems with patient determination. Seeing him this agitated was more frightening than any shouting match would have been. "Look at this," he said quietly, opening the tablet to display a map with colored dots marking various locations throughout our city. The dots formed a pattern that made my stomach clench. 3 nights a week, consistently, Danielle's car appeared at the Riverside Inn downtown, a modest hotel that catered to business travelers and offered hourly rates for obvious reasons. "GPS tracking from her car," Anthony explained, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd had their worst suspicions confirmed. "Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evening for the past 3 months, always between 7 and 10 p.m. I stared at the evidence, my mind automatically cataloging Thomas's schedule, client meetings with the Peterson account on Tuesdays, Thursday evening strategy sessions for the Morrison campaign, Sunday planning meetings for the upcoming week. All perfect alibis for an affair that had been happening right under my nose. "How long have you suspected?" I asked. "Honestly, since Harper was born. Maybe before." Anthony rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. "But suspecting and knowing are different things. I needed proof before I could act on it." We sat in my kitchen for hours that night, 2 betrayed spouses examining the wreckage of our marriages with the clinical detachment of investigators. Anthony showed me credit card statements, hotel receipts he'd found in Danielle's purse, photographs of Thomas's car in the hotel parking lot taken from his office building across the street. Neither of us cried or raged. We were both too exhausted for dramatics, too depleted by years of watching our spouses drift away to waste energy on emotional outbursts. "What do we do now?" I asked as dawn began filtering through my kitchen windows. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across my table. "We wait," he said finally. "Harper's only 6. She doesn't deserve to have her world destroyed over adult failures." That night, we made a pact that would define the next 9 years of our lives. We would wait until Harper was old enough to understand the situation before confronting Thomas and Danielle. In the meantime, we would document everything. Anthony's methodical nature made him the perfect investigator. He installed tracking software on devices, photographed evidence with timestamps, and created detailed spreadsheets documenting patterns of behavior. I began paying closer attention to Thomas's interactions with Danielle during group gatherings, noting the inside jokes, the intimate glances, the way they moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of lovers rather than friends. We met monthly to share information, 2 wounded people finding unexpected strength in our shared betrayal. Anthony would arrive with his latest findings, and I'd share my observations from social events or conversations. It was a strange partnership built on mutual devastation, but sustained by a shared commitment to protecting Harper from the truth until she was emotionally equipped to handle it. The investigation revealed the depth of their deception. Hotel stays weren't random. They followed a careful schedule designed to avoid suspicion. Thomas's work meetings were fabricated, complete with fake client names and manufactured project deadlines. Danielle had created an elaborate system of alibis involving fictional friends and imaginary commitments. What hurt most wasn't just the affair itself, but the calculated nature of their betrayal. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a spontaneous attraction that spiraled out of control. This was a deliberate, ongoing deception that required planning, coordination, and a complete disregard for the people they'd promised to love and protect. As Harper grew older, Thomas's involvement in her life intensified rather than diminished, making our situation increasingly complex and painful to navigate. Then I got sick. The autoimmune diagnosis came 3 years into Anthony's and my secret investigation, hitting me like a freight train when I thought I was finally gaining ground in understanding the depth of Thomas and Danielle's betrayal. What started as persistent fatigue and joint pain escalated into something that required immediate hospitalization and long-term treatment. I expected Thomas to step up. Despite everything I knew about his affair, some foolish part of me still believed that serious illness might remind him of his wedding vows, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. Instead, his hospital visits became increasingly perfunctory, brief obligations fulfilled with the minimum effort required to avoid looking completely heartless to the medical staff. "How are you feeling today?" he'd ask, standing near the door like he was ready to bolt at the first opportunity. "Tired?" I'd answer honestly. "The treatment is rough, but the doctors think that's good. I'm glad you're getting the care you need." He'd glance at his watch, then at his phone. "Anywhere except at me lying in that hospital bed. I should get going. Work's been crazy lately." Work. Always work. The same fictional work commitments that provided cover for his hotel meetings with Danielle. Meanwhile, Harper visited me every single day after school. At 9 years old, she'd arrive with her backpack full of homework, spreading math worksheets across my hospital tray table and asking for help with reading assignments. She'd show me her drawings, tell me about playground drama, and curl up in the visitor's chair to watch cartoons on the tiny television mounted to the wall. "Why doesn't Thomas come to see you more?" Harper asked one afternoon, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of my loneliness. "He's very busy with work," I replied, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Daddy Anthony says work is never more important than family," Harper said matter-of-factly, then returned to coloring a get-well card she was making for me. Anthony had quietly stepped into the void Thomas created, handling my medical paperwork, driving me to specialist appointments, and ensuring I had everything I needed during the long stretches when Thomas was conspicuously absent. The contrast between the two men became stark and painful, one proving his loyalty through actions while the other demonstrated his priorities through neglect. For 6 years, Harper remained my constant companion and source of joy during the darkest period of my life. Even as my health improved and I was able to return home, she continued her daily visits, now helping with my art projects and listening to me read chapters from my latest children's books. But something shifted after Harper's 15th birthday. The daily visits stopped abruptly. At first I assumed it was normal teenage behavior, friends becoming more important, social activities taking priority, the natural distancing that happens as children grow into adolescence. When a week passed without seeing her, I called Thomas. "Where's Harper been? I haven't seen her since last Tuesday." Thomas's response was dismissive, almost irritated. "She's 15 now, Rachel. She's got her own life, friends, activities, teenage stuff. She can't be expected to visit you every day like when she was little." But something in his tone suggested there was more to Harper's absence than normal adolescent development. When I mentioned it to Anthony during one of our monthly meetings, his expression darkened. "Thomas has been talking to Harper," Anthony said quietly, "telling her things about you that aren't true." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "What kind of things?" "That you're bitter and jealous of their family happiness, that your illness was exaggerated for attention, that you've been manipulative and possessive trying to break up his relationship with Danielle." Anthony's hands clenched into fists on my kitchen table. "He's convinced her that you're the problem in all of this." The systematic poisoning of Harper against me was perhaps the cruelest thing Thomas had done yet. This child who had been my anchor during the worst years of my life, who had shown more loyalty and love than my own husband, was now being manipulated into believing I was the villain in a story she didn't fully understand. I tried calling Harper directly, but she didn't answer. I sent texts that went unread. The teenager who had once spent every afternoon in my hospital room now treated me like a stranger she wanted to avoid. Thomas had successfully isolated me from everyone I loved, believing I was too weak and sick to fight back. He underestimated how much strength can be forged in the furnace of betrayal and abandonment. 2 years passed this way. 2 years of increasing isolation while my health stabilized and my career quietly exploded into unprecedented success. Publishers were competing for my next series. International rights deals were materializing faster than my agent could negotiate them. Movie studios were calling about adaptation rights. But professionally, success felt meaningless when my personal life had been systematically destroyed by the man who was supposed to protect and cherish me. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was reviewing illustrations on my laptop, putting finishing touches on artwork for my latest book deal, when Thomas walked into my hospital room during one of my routine follow-up appointments. But this wasn't the sheepish, guilty Thomas I'd grown accustomed to during his brief, uncomfortable visits. This Thomas walked with swagger, chest puffed out with arrogance I'd never seen before. And he wasn't alone. Danielle clung to his arm possessively, wearing the triumphant smile of someone who believed she'd finally won a prize she'd been coveting for years. Her engagement ring, a ring that should have been my upgrade someday, caught the harsh fluorescent lighting as she squeezed Thomas's bicep encouragingly. They had dressed for this moment. Thomas wore his best suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for job interviews years ago. Danielle had styled her hair perfectly and chosen an outfit that screamed confidence and victory. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was a performance they'd planned and rehearsed. Thomas approached my hospital bed with theatrical flair, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket like a magician revealing his final trick. He dropped it on my bedside table with deliberate precision, the small piece of cardstock landing with a sharp slap against the surface. "My lawyer's contact information," he announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering what he believed was devastating news. "We're getting divorced." The audacity of the timing, serving divorce papers to your hospitalized wife, revealed a level of cruelty I hadn't known he possessed. But worse than the timing was the obvious satisfaction he took in what he believed was my complete powerlessness to resist. Danielle squeezed his arm again, prompting him to continue his prepared speech like a director encouraging an actor to deliver his lines with more conviction. "You don't work," Thomas continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "So you'll pay me alimony. $1,000 a month seems fair, don't you think?" The absurdity of demanding financial support from a woman lying in a hospital bed revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood my actual circumstances. But his next words were designed purely to wound. "I'm done being tied to a lazy, worthless woman," he sneered, his contempt so complete and dismissive that I finally understood our entire marriage had been built on lies. This was who Thomas really was when he thought I had no power to fight back, cruel, calculating, completely convinced of his own superiority. Danielle nodded sympathetically beside him, playing her role as the understanding new partner who supported his difficult decision to abandon his sick wife. They had constructed an elaborate narrative where I was the villain, the burden, the obstacle to their deserved happiness, the dead weight that had been holding Thomas back from his true potential. But instead of the breakdown they'd clearly anticipated, something unexpected happened. Years of hidden hurt and suppressed anger crystallized into cold, clear determination. I felt a strange sense of liberation wash over me, as if Thomas's cruelty had finally freed me from any lingering guilt about destroying his life. I looked at Thomas, then at Danielle, and smiled genuinely for the first time in months. "Fine," I said simply. "Let's get divorced." Thomas blinked, clearly thrown off script. He'd prepared for tears, for desperate bargaining, for the emotional collapse that would validate his narrative about my instability. My calm acceptance wasn't part of their carefully rehearsed performance. "Fine?" Danielle's voice cracked slightly. "That's it? You're just going to agree?" "What did you expect?" I asked pleasantly, closing my laptop with deliberate care. "You've made your choice. I'm simply accepting it." Behind Thomas's surprise, I could see confusion flickering across both their faces. They had scripted this confrontation expecting drama that would confirm their story about my emotional instability. Instead, they were getting serene agreement from a woman who seemed almost relieved by their news. "Well, good," Thomas stammered, trying to regain his composure. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," I replied, and something in my tone made him shift uncomfortably. They left my hospital room that afternoon with less satisfaction than they'd anticipated, but still convinced they'd won. Thomas had no idea he'd just lit the fuse on his own destruction. The moment they were gone, I opened my laptop and began making calls, first to my lawyer, then to my accountant, then to my business manager. The woman who had spent years downplaying her success was done pretending to be weak. That evening, I made the call that would change everything. "Sarah, it's Rachel," I said when my lawyer answered. "Remember that house discussion we had last year about asset protection? The property registration under your business name?" "Of course. I need you to cancel Thomas's lease immediately, begin eviction proceedings first thing tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. "Rachel, are you sure? That's going to create quite a shock for him." "That's exactly what I'm counting on." 10 days later, while I was still completing my final round of treatments, my phone rang with the confirmation I'd been waiting for. The sheriff had delivered the eviction notice. Thomas had 72 hours to vacate the premises. His first voicemail arrived within an hour. "What the hell is this?" Thomas's voice was shrill with panic. "You can't just kick us out. This is illegal. I'm calling my lawyer." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The second call came 20 minutes later. "Rachel, pick up the phone. Where are we supposed to go?" "Danielle's got Harper to think about. You can't just throw a child out on the street." Interesting how quickly Harper became a convenient shield when Thomas needed to play victim. The third call was different. Thomas had clearly been coached, probably by whatever lawyer he'd managed to reach on short notice. "Rachel, I know you're upset, but we need to discuss this rationally. Let's work out some kind of arrangement until the divorce is finalized. I'm willing to pay fair market rent." I answered this one. "Thomas," I said calmly, "the house is registered under my business name. You've been living there rent-free for 8 years as a courtesy that I'm now withdrawing. The lease cancellation is completely legal. Your lawyer can confirm that. But where are we supposed to go?" "That's between you and your lawyer." I hung up. The beauty of my legal position was its simplicity. Thomas had never contributed to the down payment, never been added to the deed, never even paid utilities. He'd been living in my property as a guest, and guests can be asked to leave. Within a week, Thomas and Danielle had been forced to move in with his parents, a humiliating arrangement that put their affair on full display for his family. Margaret, Thomas's mother, had always prided herself on raising a son with strong moral character. Watching him abandon his sick wife for his best friend's spouse shattered her illusions about her perfect boy. 3 weeks later, I was finally released from the hospital. Anthony picked me up, and we drove directly to the modest ranch house where Thomas had grown up. It was time for the confrontation I'd been planning since that terrible day in my hospital room. The moment I walked through the front door with Anthony beside me, Thomas's face drained of color. He hadn't expected me to recover so quickly, and he certainly hadn't anticipated me arriving with backup, especially not the backup he'd betrayed just as thoroughly as he'd betrayed me. "Rachel," he started, but I held up a hand to silence him. Harper was there, sitting in the corner of the living room, looking deeply uncomfortable. At 16, she was old enough to sense the adult tensions swirling around her, but still young enough to be confused about her role in all of it. Danielle immediately tried to take control of the situation, launching into a defensive speech that revealed just how entitled she'd become. "I don't know why everyone's being so dramatic about this," she declared, standing up from the couch with theatrical authority. "Thomas and I found real love together. That's something to celebrate, not punish. Besides," she gestured toward Harper, "his parents are getting a blood grandchild now. That has to count for something." The audacity was breathtaking. She truly believed that her affair and Harper's existence trumped all other considerations. Marriage vows, loyalty, basic human decency. But what happened next was worth every moment of pain I'd endured over the past decade. Harper looked up from where she'd been staring at her hands, her young face carrying a maturity that spoke to everything she'd witnessed and processed over the years. She looked directly at Thomas, the man who had played father to her for 10 years, who had attended every school event and soccer practice, who had prioritized her needs over his own marriage. "My dad is Anthony," she said clearly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "That's the only dad I want." The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Thomas's face crumbled as if Harper had physically struck him. All those years of school conferences, bedtime stories, and soccer practices, reduced to nothing by one teenager's honest declaration of loyalty to the man who had actually earned the title of father. Danielle looked stricken, finally realizing that her daughter's allegiance lay with her legal father, not her mother's affair partner. In one sentence, Harper had destroyed the foundation of their entire justification for their betrayal. "Harper," Thomas began, his voice broken. "No," she interrupted. "I know what you did. Dad Anthony told me everything. How you and Mom lied to everyone for years. How you hurt Rachel when she was sick. How you made me stop visiting her by telling me lies about her being jealous and manipulative." Thomas's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then Anthony delivered the legal revelation that completed Danielle's destruction. "Oh, by the way," he said with quiet satisfaction, pulling a folder from his jacket, "you and I are still legally married, Danielle. Our divorce papers were never finalized due to a technicality I chose not to correct." The color drained from Danielle's face as the implications crashed over her. Her marriage to Thomas was completely invalid. She had no legal standing as his spouse, no claim to any shared assets, no protection under spousal privilege laws. Worse still, she could potentially face bigamy charges if anyone chose to pursue them. Anthony had been meticulous in his revenge planning, using his technical expertise to exploit every legal loophole while Danielle played house with another woman's husband. Thomas, desperate to salvage something from the complete wreckage of his plans, made one final attempt at intimidation. "So what?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You're sick, Rachel. You'll be broke in a year, dead in 2. What are you really going to do?" That was my cue for the greatest revelation of all. I pulled out my phone with deliberate calm and opened my banking app, turning the screen toward them. "I make $450,000 a year now," I said quietly. "I'm a best-selling children's author with a movie deal in production. Want to see my royalty statements?" Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally desperate calculation. In the span of 10 seconds, I watched him process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about our power dynamic. "450,000? He repeated slowly, as if saying the number would somehow make it less real. "Per year," I confirmed, scrolling through my phone to show monthly deposit screenshots, royalty checks, licensing deals, international rights. My Brave Little Fox series is being translated into 12 languages. The movie deal I mentioned, Netflix just green-lit it for production. Danielle's grip on Thomas's arm tightened until her knuckles went white. I could practically see her brain recalculating everything: the comfortable life she thought she was gaining, the financial security she'd assumed would come with stealing my husband, the future she'd built in her imagination. Thomas's transformation was immediate and nauseating. "Rachel," he said, his voice suddenly honeyed with the charm he'd used when we first met, "maybe we're being hasty here. We've been together for 15 years. That has to count for something." "What are you doing?" Danielle's voice rose to a shriek. "I'm trying to salvage our family," Thomas replied smoothly. never taking his eyes off my phone screen. "Rachel, we could work this out. Go to counseling. Take some time to rebuild what we had." The audacity was breathtaking. Within minutes of demanding alimony from his lazy, worthless wife, he was ready to reconcile now that he understood my actual net worth. But Danielle's scream of betrayal cut through his calculated charm. "Are you serious right now? After everything we've risked? After all the promises you made?" She turned to face him fully, and I saw the exact moment she realized Thomas would abandon her the instant a better option appeared. Exactly as he had abandoned me when he thought she was the better option. "This is what he does," I said quietly to Danielle. "He finds someone useful and discards them when they stop serving his purposes." Thomas's father, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke from his position by the fireplace. "Get out," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a successful business through decades of hard work and integrity. "Both of you, out of my house." "Dad," Thomas started, but his father held up a weathered hand. "I raised you better than this, Thomas. I taught you about loyalty, about keeping your word, about standing by the people who love you." His disappointment was crushing to witness. "Learning that you abandoned your sick wife for this situation, it makes me question everything I thought I knew about the son I raised." Within the week, Thomas was fired from his father's construction company. The comfortable position he'd assumed would always be there as his safety net. His father arranged for him to work on a commercial fishing boat, the kind of back-breaking, dangerous labor that paid minimum wage and required pre-dawn departures regardless of weather conditions. The irony was poetic justice at its finest. The man who had sneered about my laziness was now working 16-hour days hauling nets and processing fish, coming home exhausted and reeking of the ocean, barely making enough to survive in a tiny apartment he shared with 2 other crew members. Meanwhile, his former colleagues whispered about his downfall, ensuring he'd never find comparable employment in the local business community. Word traveled fast in our circles about the man who'd abandoned his hospitalized wife for his best friend's spouse. Danielle's collapse was even more spectacular. Without Thomas's income, and with no legal claim to any shared assets due to her invalid marriage, her entire lifestyle evaporated overnight. Anthony filed for immediate custody modification, presenting documented evidence of her infidelity, abandonment of parental responsibilities, and the instability her bigamous relationship had created for Harper. The family court judge was particularly harsh on Danielle's deception, noting that her invalid second marriage demonstrated a pattern of dishonesty that made her unsuitable as Harper's primary guardian. "Ms. Morrison," the judge said during the custody hearing, "your choices have created an environment of instability and moral confusion that is detrimental to your daughter's well-being." Danielle was ordered to supervised visitation only, forced to work 2 part-time jobs just to afford a studio apartment across town. Her carefully cultivated friendships built on gossip and superficial connections couldn't survive the scandal. Former friends avoided her calls and crossed the street when they saw her in public. She became a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties and book clubs, the beautiful woman who had destroyed everything for a man who ultimately abandoned her the moment someone more valuable appeared. Thomas stopped taking her calls within 3 months, leaving her completely alone with the consequences of their shared betrayal. But the most meaningful restoration came through Harper's gradual return to my life. As the truth about Thomas's manipulation came to light, Harper began reaching out tentatively through text messages, then phone calls, and finally awkward but genuine visits to my house. "I'm sorry," was the first thing she said when she appeared at my door 6 months after the confrontation. "I should have known better. You were never jealous or manipulative. Thomas lied to me about everything." Our conversations were stilted at first, both of us navigating the damage that years of lies and manipulation had created. But slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding the connection we'd shared during her childhood. Harper was studying languages at community college, dreaming of becoming a translator. Her eyes lit up when I told her about the international publishers interested in adapting my books for global audiences. "I could help you translate your stories," she said excitedly during one of our Sunday dinners. "Imagine brave little Fox teaching courage to children in Spain or Germany or Japan." Watching her enthusiasm reminded me why I'd loved her so fiercely as a child. She had inherited Anthony's steady character and intellectual curiosity, not her mother's manipulative tendencies. Our renewed bond felt stronger than our original connection, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than childhood innocence. Anthony's proposal came on a quiet Sunday evening as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing the legal documents that had finalized both our divorces. We'd been meeting weekly for months, ostensibly to handle the aftermath of our respective legal battles, but really because we'd become each other's anchor through the storm. "I know this might seem too soon," he said, setting down his pen and looking directly at me, "but we've been through hell together. We know each other's worst moments, and we're still here." His proposal wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. There were no flowers, no dramatic gestures, no passionate declarations of undying love. Instead, it was practical, honest, and based on proven compatibility and shared values. "We've already survived betrayal, illness, and legal warfare as a team," he continued. "Our partnership has been tested in ways most couples never face. I think we could build something real together, something based on actual trust instead of pretty lies." I appreciated his honesty about the timing and circumstances. We weren't two young people falling in love for the first time. We were two wounded adults who had found strength in each other's company. "I need time to think," I told him. "But I'm not saying no." The possibility of building something genuine with someone who had proven his loyalty through actions rather than words was appealing. But I wanted to choose it freely as a celebration of our future rather than a reaction to our shared trauma. 6 months later, I stood in my new art studio, a bright, spacious room in the house I'd reclaimed from Thomas, now transformed into something entirely mine. Sunlight streamed through windows I'd had enlarged, illuminating canvases covered with illustrations for my latest book series. My phone buzzed with another call from a Hollywood executive interested in adaptation rights. The movie deal I'd casually mentioned during that confrontation was now moving into pre-production with a list voice actors attached to bring brave little Fox to life on screen. My health had stabilized completely with proper treatment and the dramatic reduction in stress that came with removing toxic people from my life. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself properly, not just my financial success, but my worth as a person who deserved loyalty, honesty, and respect. The woman who had once hidden her achievements to protect her husband's fragile ego was now confidently building an empire, making decisions based on what served my goals rather than what made others comfortable. Every morning, I woke up grateful for the divorce that had set me free to become who I was always meant to be. Thomas had called me lazy and worthless, but his cruel words had become the catalyst for me to claim my full power and create the life I truly wanted. And the look on his face when he realized what he'd lost? Absolutely priceless.